I woke up at 6 a.m. to fists pounding against my apartment door, hard enough to rattle the frame. I opened it still half asleep, wearing yesterday's clothes, and found 4 officers with weapons drawn and a warrant in the lead officer's hand. "Kang Tae-min," the officer said, "you are under arrest for the murder of Yoon Sung-hyun." Sung-hyun was my business partner, my best friend since university. We had built our logistics startup together over 6 brutal years, sleeping in the office, eating instant noodles for months at a time, betting everything on a company that had finally started making real money. He had been alive at midnight. I knew because he had texted me, something about finalizing tomorrow's investor contracts. I had gone to sleep at 1 a.m. I had not left my apartment. I told the officers this. They did not care. They cuffed me, walked me past my neighbors, and drove me to a station where I sat in an interrogation room for 6 hours before anyone explained what evidence they had against me. Security footage showed someone matching my exact height and build, entering Sung-hyun's apartment building at 1:47 a.m. My fingerprints, they claimed, were found on the murder weapon, a kitchen knife from Sung-hyun's own apartment. Text messages from my phone, sent at 1:52 a.m., threatened Sung-hyun over what the messages called a 50 million won debt. I had never sent those messages. I did not know about any 50 million won debt. I had been asleep at 1:52 a.m., my phone charging on my nightstand, where it always charged overnight. But the detective across the table, a tired-looking man named Inspector Beck, showed me phone records that placed my device pinging off a cell tower 2 blocks from Sung-hyun's apartment at exactly that time. My own phone, my own account, data that should have been impossible unless someone had physically taken my phone from my apartment while I slept. The court assigned representation, a young associate named Park Ji-woo from the firm our company retained, reviewed my case for exactly 11 minutes before recommending I accept a plea deal. 15 years, reduced from the potential life sentence, in exchange for admitting guilt and avoiding trial. I refused. I was innocent. I told her I wanted a full trial, wanted the phone records investigated, wanted to know who had access to my apartment while I slept. She looked at me with an expression I could not quite read at the time, but which I would later understand as pity, mixed with something closer to guilt. "The evidence is very strong, Mr. Kang," she said. "A trial carries significant risk of the maximum sentence. I would strongly recommend the plea deal." I refused again. She left the room looking troubled, in a way that had nothing to do with my case, and everything to do with something she was not telling me. 3 weeks before the trial began, I learned through a court document, not through any personal communication, that the board had voted to remove me from my position as co-founder and transfer my full ownership stake to the remaining partner. My shares, worth approximately $80 million based on our recent Series B valuation, had been reassigned entirely. The remaining partner who now owned everything Sung-hyun and I had built together was Han Yerim, my fiancée, the woman I had proposed to 6 months earlier, whose engagement ring I had spent 3 months' salary purchasing, who had cried and said yes and promised to build a life with me. She did not attend a single day of my trial. The prosecution's case was airtight in exactly the way that only fabricated evidence can be. Every piece fit perfectly, too perfectly, into a narrative of jealousy and financial desperation that painted me as a man who had murdered his best friend over a business dispute I had never actually experienced. During sentencing, the judge, a stern woman named Justice Cho, made a passing reference to reviewing my case alongside, and I quote, "similar recent matters involving corporate restructuring disputes." It was an odd phrase for a murder sentencing, the kind of language that belonged in a civil court, not a criminal one. I did not understand what she meant until much later. Much later, when the full scope of what had actually happened finally became clear. I was sentenced to life imprisonment. 28 years old, convicted of murdering my best friend, stripped of my company, abandoned by my fiancé, and sent to Cheonan Correctional Facility with absolutely no idea that the true conspiracy against me extended so far beyond a single murder that even the judge who sentenced me was, in some way I could not yet comprehend, connected to it. I arrived at Cheonan on a grey Tuesday morning, processed through intake with the mechanical indifference reserved for prisoners the system had already decided did not matter. Fingerprinted, photographed, assigned a number that would replace my name for the remainder of what the system considered my useful existence. My cellmate was a heavy-set man named Jung Ho-sok, serving 8 years for embezzlement, who looked me up and down when I entered our shared 6-by-8-foot space and offered a single piece of advice. "Whatever you did on the outside," he said, "does not matter in here. Only thing that matters is who you know and who you can trust. And in here, that number is usually 0. I lay on my thin mattress that first night, staring at the concrete ceiling, replaying every detail of the past 6 weeks. Sung-hyun's murder, the fabricated evidence, my removed shares, Yerim's absence, the judge's strange comment about corporate restructuring. None of it made sense as isolated incidents, but something about the timing, the precision, the way every piece of evidence had assembled so cleanly against me, suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Someone had planned this. Someone had killed Sung-hyun specifically to frame me, specifically to seize control of our company, specifically to remove me from a life I had spent 6 years building. I did not know who. I did not know why, beyond the obvious financial motive that $80 million represented. And I certainly did not know how I would ever prove my innocence from inside a maximum security prison where nobody would listen to a convicted murderer's protests. Then, at exactly 2:14 a.m., 3 hours into my first night of imprisonment, something happened that would eventually answer every question I had, though I did not understand its significance in that moment. Ding! The sound was clear, distinct, occurring somewhere inside my own awareness, rather than through my physical ears. I sat up on my mattress, heart pounding, certain I had imagined it, certain that 6 weeks of trauma had finally cracked something in my mental state. A translucent panel appeared in my vision, visible only to me, my sleeping cellmate showing no reaction whatsoever to whatever was happening in the darkness of our shared cell. Cognitive resonance system detected compatible host. Host has experienced severe psychological trauma combined with genuine innocence regarding accused crime. System activation criteria met. Initializing. I stared at the panel, uncertain whether I was hallucinating from stress or experiencing something genuinely, impossibly real. Ding! System initialization complete. Host designation, Kang Taemin. Primary ability, cognitive resonance. Host can now perceive surface-level conscious thoughts of any individual within direct visual contact, provided host maintains focused attention for a minimum of 3 seconds. Secondary ability, locked, deep memory access. Unlocks at system level 5. Tertiary ability, locked. Emotional projection, unlocks at system level 10.
I could read minds.
Not perfectly, not completely, based on the system's careful language. Surface thoughts only, for now, requiring direct visual contact and sustained attention. But even that limited capability, if genuinely real, rather than some trauma-induced delusion, represented something that could finally answer the questions consuming me since my arrest. I tested it immediately, turning to look at my sleeping cellmate, focusing my attention on his unconscious face for 3 full seconds. Nothing happened. He was asleep, his conscious mind inactive, providing nothing for whatever ability I supposedly possessed to detect. I would need to wait until morning, until I encountered someone awake, someone whose thoughts I could actually access, to determine whether this system represented genuine, reality-altering capability, or simply the beginning of a complete psychological breakdown brought on by wrongful imprisonment and the total collapse of everything I had built my adult life around. I lay back on my mattress, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since my arrest 6 weeks earlier, felt something other than despair. I felt possibility. Morning came with the metallic clang of cell doors releasing for breakfast count. I stood in the mess hall line, tray in hand, and forced myself to look directly at the nearest guard, a heavy-set man named Officer Ryu, who supervised the breakfast rotation with visible boredom. I focused. 3 seconds, counting silently. Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. The thought arrived in my mind exactly like the system had promised. Not as words I imagined, but as information I simply possessed. The way you know your own name, without having to think about how you know it. Officer Ryu was smuggling cell phones into the prison, running an operation lucrative enough that he was risking his pension to continue it. This was real, not hallucination, not trauma response. Genuine, functional, reality-altering capability that had activated inside my own mind on my first night of a life sentence for a murder I did not commit. I did nothing with this information immediately, too stunned by its confirmation to think strategically. But 3 days later, when a younger inmate named Choi Dong-hae attempted to extort my breakfast rations through implicit threat of violence, I found myself testing the system's practical application for the first time. I focused on him during his extortion attempt, holding his gaze for the required 3 seconds while he postured about what would happen if I did not comply. Ding! Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. Dong-hae was terrified of me, not because of anything I had done inside Cheonan, but because my murder conviction had preceded me, creating a reputation for violence that I had never actually demonstrated, but which every other inmate assumed was accurate, based on the crime that had put me here. I looked at him calmly, said nothing threatening, simply held his gaze for a moment longer than comfortable, and watched him retreat without his extorted breakfast, mistaking my silence for the confidence of a man who genuinely had killed before. The system was not just revealing information, it was revealing leverage. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment of eye contact inside this prison could now become an opportunity to extract truth from people who assumed their thoughts remained private. She arrived for what was supposed to be a routine appeal consultation, sitting across from me in the visitation room with the same troubled expression I remembered from our first meeting. I focused on her for the required 3 seconds while she reviewed documents she claimed contained appeal possibilities. Ding! Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. I stared at her, processing information that fundamentally rewrote my understanding of my own defense. Park Ji-woo knew I was innocent. She had known from the beginning. But someone, some entity with enough power to threaten her sister's immigration status and imply mortal danger in whatever country she would be deported to, had forced her into deliberately sabotaging my legal representation. This was not simple corporate greed anymore. This was coordinated, multi-layered conspiracy involving immigration threats, implied violence, and enough institutional reach to manipulate legal defense from the outside. Ji-woo, I said quietly, watching her flinch at my tone. I know you have been threatened. I do not know how I know, but I know. Whoever did this to me, they own more than just my case. Tell me what you can, even indirectly, even if you cannot say it directly. Her eyes widened with something between terror and desperate relief, the expression of someone who had been carrying an impossible secret and suddenly found an opening to release even a fraction of its weight. I cannot tell you names, she whispered, glancing toward the security camera in the corner of the visitation room. But I can tell you that the person who approached me about your case used language that suggested significant judicial influence. They mentioned Justice Cho specifically, implying a prior relationship that went beyond normal professional courtesy. The comment during sentencing, I said, about similar recent matters involving corporate restructuring disputes. Ji-woo's face went pale. How do you know about that comment? I was not present for sentencing. I did not have an answer that would not sound insane, so I said nothing, simply watching her process the implication that I possessed information I should not have access to. That phrase, she finally said, her voice barely audible, is not standard judicial language for a murder case. It sounds like language from civil litigation involving hostile corporate takeovers. If Justice Cho has handled similar cases recently, cases where corporate restructuring disputes resulted in criminal charges against inconvenient parties, that would suggest a pattern, a method, someone using the criminal justice system as a tool for corporate acquisition. I focused on Hoseok that night as he described his own case, the details he had shared casually during our first week of forced proximity, searching now for patterns I had missed before understanding what I was truly looking for. Ding. Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. I stopped him mid-sentence. What tech startup founder? I asked. 2 years ago. Hoseok blinked, surprised by my sudden interest in a detail he had not actually said aloud, existing only within his internal thoughts that my system had somehow accessed alongside his spoken words. I did not mention any tech startup founder, he said slowly, his expression shifting towards suspicious confusion. How did you know I was thinking about that? I could not answer honestly, but I pressed forward anyway, understanding that whatever pattern Hoseok's memory contained represented crucial information about the scope of what had happened to me. Please, I said, this matters more than you understand. Tell me about this other case. Hoseok studied me for a long moment, weighing whatever trust our shared cell had built over 3 weeks of forced cohabitation, then began describing a case from 2 years earlier that made my blood run cold with recognition. A technology startup founder, convicted of financial fraud after his own company's records were allegedly altered to show embezzlement that he insisted he never committed. His business partner had suddenly gained majority control of the company following his arrest. His fiancée at the time had also distanced herself from him entirely during the trial, later marrying into significant wealth within the same industry sector. The founder had died in prison 18 months into his sentence. Officially, a heart attack. Unofficially, according to prison rumors that Hosiak had heard from other inmates who witnessed the aftermath, the death showed signs inconsistent with natural cardiac failure, though the investigation had been closed within days without meaningful forensic examination. I sat on my thin mattress, processing information that transformed my understanding of my own situation from isolated tragedy into something far more systematic and dangerous. I was not the first person this had happened to. Someone, some organization or individual, with reach spanning corporate law, judicial influence, and apparently the willingness to arrange deaths inside prison facilities when previous victims became inconvenient, had done this before, successfully, with enough precision and institutional protection that the pattern remained invisible to anyone who did not possess my particular impossible advantage. I needed names. I needed to understand who this technology founder had been, who his business partner was, whether any connection existed between his case and mine beyond superficial structural similarity. And I needed to survive long enough inside Cheonan to actually investigate, understanding now that my own life expectancy inside this facility might be measured in months rather than the decades my sentence technically demanded. If the pattern Hosok had just described represented standard procedure for silencing inconvenient victims once their usefulness as scapegoats had been exhausted, the system's activation inside my mind was not simply a strange psychological phenomenon triggered by trauma. It was, I was beginning to understand, potentially the only advantage I possessed against a conspiracy sophisticated enough to have successfully executed this exact scheme at least once before. And quite possibly many more times than even Hosiok's prison rumors suggested. I closed my eyes that night, the system's interface still faintly visible in my perception, even with my eyes shut, and began planning not just how to prove my innocence, but how to survive long enough to expose whatever organization had turned corporate acquisition into a machine for manufacturing convicted murderers out of inconvenient business partners. Somewhere outside these walls, Han Yerim was living in the apartment we had chosen together, wearing the ring I had purchased, controlling the company Songhyun and I had built from nothing. I intended to find out exactly how much she actually knew about what had been done to me, and whether the woman I had planned to marry was innocent bystander or active architect of my destruction. I requested library access the following week, using my limited privileges as a model prisoner during my first month, a status I maintained specifically to preserve access to resources I now understood I would need. The prison librarian, an older inmate named Song Minho, serving a lengthy sentence for financial crimes I had not yet investigated, managed the facility's small collection of legal reference materials and old newspapers that prisoners occasionally used for appeal research. I focused on him while he processed my library card renewal, watching his hands move through routine paperwork while my system worked to extract whatever surface thoughts might prove useful. Ding! Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. I straightened immediately, the casual thought revealing something I had not anticipated. Song Minho had been unconsciously collecting information about cases similar to mine, driven by some instinct or pattern recognition he had not fully articulated even to himself, accumulating newspaper clippings about business fraud convictions that shared structural similarities, without fully understanding why he found them compelling enough to preserve. "You mentioned a folder," I said carefully, testing whether direct reference to his internal thoughts would create suspicion or simply seem like a lucky guess. Minho looked up sharply. "I did not mention any folder. I need to see it," I said, ignoring his confusion. "Please. This matters more than you can imagine." Something in my tone, or perhaps something in the desperate focus of my expression, convinced him to set aside appropriate skepticism about how I knew details he had not spoken aloud. He retrieved a worn manila folder from beneath a stack of legal reference books, sliding it across the counter with visible reluctance. Inside were 7 newspaper clippings, each documenting a different corporate fraud case spanning the past 6 years, each involving a business founder or executive convicted of financial crimes or violence against former business partners. each resulting in majority ownership, transferring to remaining partners or associates following conviction. 3 of the 7 cases, including the technology startup founder Hoseok had mentioned, showed the convicted individual dying in prison within 18 months of sentencing, officially from natural causes, unofficially surrounded by the same prison rumors of suspicious circumstances that had followed the tech founder's death. I spent 3 days studying the clippings during my limited library access, cross-referencing names, dates, and case details with an obsessive focus that other inmates began to notice, though nobody questioned a convicted murderer's sudden interest in old newspapers, assuming perhaps that I was simply searching for appeal precedents, like countless prisoners before me. The pattern that emerged made my hands shake as I finally understood its full implication. 4 of the 7 cases, including mine, had been defended by attorneys from the same law firm, Kwon and Associates, a mid-sized corporate legal practice that specialized, according to their public marketing materials, in technology sector business disputes and criminal defense for corporate executives. Park Ji-woo, my own attorney, worked for Kwon and Associates. This was not simply a firm that happened to represent multiple defendants in similar cases. This was a firm being systematically used, whether through coercion like what had been done to Ji-woo or through active complicity from senior partners, to ensure that defense representation in these specific cases was compromised from the beginning, guaranteeing convictions regardless of actual guilt or innocence. Ji-woo arrived for our next scheduled visit, looking thinner than our previous meeting, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting sleepless nights that matched my own recent insomnia. I focused on her immediately, holding her gaze the required 3 seconds before she could settle into whatever prepared conversation she had planned. Ding! Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. Ji-woo, I said quietly, before she could speak. I know about the pattern, Kwon and Associates, the other cases, the convictions that seemed designed to fail regardless of evidence. Her face went completely white, hands trembling slightly, as she processed that I possessed information she had been guarding with desperate secrecy. How? She whispered, then caught herself, glancing toward the security camera with practiced caution. We cannot discuss this here. Too many risks. But I need you to trust that I have been trying to help, even when my actions seem to suggest otherwise. I believe you, I said, and meant it completely, understanding now the impossible position she had been navigating since accepting my case, forced to sabotage my defense publicly while secretly investigating the very conspiracy that had compromised her ability to help me openly. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to barely audible whisper, while maintaining the outward appearance of normal conversation for anyone monitoring the visitation room's audio recording. Kwon reports to someone, she breathed. I found records, financial transfers, communication patterns that suggest our firm receives significant off-book compensation for handling certain cases in specific ways. The money originates from a holding company registered in Singapore, multiple shell corporations deep, but I managed to trace one layer further than whoever set up this structure probably anticipated. What did you find? I asked, matching her whispered urgency. A name, she said. Just one name, connected to the ultimate beneficial ownership of the Singapore entity. I do not know if this person is the true mastermind or simply another layer of protection, but it is the deepest connection I have managed to trace so far. She hesitated, glancing again toward the camera, then wrote something on a small piece of paper hidden beneath her legal documents, sliding it toward me with practiced subtlety developed through weeks of secret investigation. I glanced down at the paper before she could withdraw it, reading a name that detonated inside my chest like a physical blow. Han Jae-won, Han Yerim's father. I sat frozen across from Ji-woo, processing implications that rewrote 6 years of my life in a single devastating instant. Han Jae-won, Yerim's father, a wealthy industrialist whose business empire I had always understood as separate from our own technology startup, connected through his daughter's engagement to me, but never, I had believed, directly involved in our company's operations or growth. Had Yerim known? I asked Ji-woo directly, no longer caring whether the question sounded desperate or unprofessional. Did she know what her father was planning? Ji-woo shook her head slowly. I do not know, she admitted. My research shows financial connections between Han Jae-won's holding companies and the scheme targeting these business founders, but I have found nothing definitively linking your fiancé to direct knowledge of the conspiracy itself. I felt something twist painfully in my chest, memories of 6 years with Yerim cascading through my mind with new, terrible potential meaning. Had she genuinely loved me, or had our relationship been engineered from the beginning, a calculated approach designed to eventually position her as beneficiary once her father's scheme reached its inevitable conclusion? "I need to speak with her directly," I said. "I need to read her thoughts myself, to know for certain whether she was complicit, or simply another victim of her father's manipulation, used without her knowledge to facilitate my destruction." Jiwoo studied me with an expression that suggested she understood I possessed some capability beyond normal comprehension, though she had wisely avoided asking direct questions about how I kept accessing information that should have been impossible for me to know. "That will be extremely difficult to arrange," she said carefully. "Prison visitation requires approved visitor status, and given the circumstances of your case, I doubt Han Yerim would voluntarily agree to visit the man convicted of murdering his business partner, particularly given her current position controlling the company that conviction transferred to her." "There has to be a way," I said, desperation edging into my voice despite my attempts at controlled calm. "I need to know the truth, not just for my own defense, but because I need to understand exactly how deep this conspiracy runs, whether Yerim represents genuine threat or potential ally who might not fully understand her own father's actions." Jiwoo was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing some possibility she had not yet mentioned. Then she spoke, her voice carrying new determination beneath the exhaustion. "There might be another approach," she said. "Han Jaewon is hosting a major business gala in 3 weeks, celebrating what public announcements describe as a significant new partnership between his holding company and several technology sector investments, including, according to preliminary reports, your former company under Yerim's current leadership." "I do not understand how that helps me," I said. "I am in prison. I cannot attend business galas." "No," Jiwoo agreed, "but I can. And if I can gain access to that event, positioned correctly, I might be able to gather additional evidence, perhaps even overhear conversations, that would clarify Yerim's actual involvement, or lack thereof, in her father's scheme." She paused, her expression shifting towards something more calculated, more strategic than the frightened attorney I had first encountered weeks earlier. "This is extremely dangerous," she continued. "If Kwon, or anyone connected to Han Jaewon's organization, discovers my independent investigation, the consequences could extend far beyond my sister's visa status. But I have already committed to uncovering the truth about your case, and about the others before you. I am not willing to stop, now that we finally understand the true scope of what we are facing." I looked at this woman who had been forced into betraying me publicly, while secretly risking everything to eventually expose the truth, and felt something I had not experienced since my arrest 6 weeks earlier. Genuine hope, tempered by the crushing weight of understanding exactly how powerful and far-reaching the conspiracy against me truly was. "Be careful," I said, meaning it with complete sincerity, despite the desperate need driving my request. "Whatever you discover, document everything, but do not take unnecessary risks. I have already lost my company, my freedom, and potentially the woman I plan to marry. I cannot bear losing you as well, not after everything you have risked to help me, even while circumstances forced you to appear as my enemy." Jiwoo nodded, gathering her documents as our visitation time drew toward its scheduled conclusion. "I will contact you through official legal channels once I have gathered whatever information the gala provides," she said. "Continue building whatever internal understanding you have been developing here. I suspect you possess resources I do not fully understand, but which may prove essential once we have enough evidence to actually challenge this conspiracy through legitimate channels." She left the visitation room, and I sat alone for several minutes before guards escorted me back toward my cell block, my mind racing through the implications of everything I had learned. Han Jaewon, orchestrating a scheme that had already claimed at least 3 lives beyond mine, using his own daughter's relationships as unwitting or perhaps knowing tools for corporate acquisition disguised as criminal justice. I needed to understand the full scope of this conspiracy before Jiwoo's dangerous investigation potentially exposed her to the same fate that had befallen the technology founder whose death had first alerted me to this pattern's existence. And I needed to develop my system's capabilities further, understanding that surface-level thought reading, however valuable, might prove insufficient against an organization apparently sophisticated enough to manipulate judges, coerce attorneys, and eliminate inconvenient witnesses without triggering meaningful investigation. That night, lying on my thin mattress, while Hoseok's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep beside me. I focused inward, for the first time since the system's activation, examining my own capabilities with new strategic purpose rather than simple reactive discovery. Ding! System status query processed. Current level 2. Experience accumulated through successful cognitive resonance applications. 340 of 1000 required for level 3 advancement. Estimated time to level 5 unlock. Deep memory access. Approximately 4 to 6 weeks at current usage pace, assuming continued active application of surface-level reading capabilities. 4 to 6 weeks. I did not know if Jiwoo's investigation or my own survival inside a prison system that had already apparently arranged one convenient death would allow me that much time. But I intended to use every day available to me, extracting whatever truth I could from every mind within reach, building toward the moment when my system's growing capabilities would finally provide sufficient evidence to expose Han Jae-won's conspiracy, and, hopefully, determine once and for all whether the woman I had loved for 6 years had been genuine partner or calculated instrument in the destruction of everything I had built. The system chimed once more as I finally drifted toward exhausted sleep. Ding! New objective generated. Investigate Han Yerim. Priority, critical. Emotional stakes, severe. Recommended approach, patience, strategic information gathering, and preparation for outcomes that may prove devastating regardless of eventual truth discovered. Jiwoo requested emergency legal visitation on a Thursday afternoon, her expression carrying none of the fear from our previous meetings, but instead something closer to controlled excitement mixed with fresh horror. She placed a small audio device on the table between us, the recording quality poor, but the voices unmistakably clear enough to identify. I positioned myself near the door during the cocktail hour, she explained quietly, before Han Jae-won's speech. I overheard a conversation between him and Yerim in a private hallway that I do not believe either of them intended anyone to witness. She played the recording. Yerim's voice, tight with barely controlled fury, demanding to know why company financial records showed transfers to accounts she did not recognize, accounts that traced back to legal representation for cases she had never authorized her father to influence. Han Jae-won's response, dismissive at first, then increasingly cold as Yerim pressed harder, finally admitting that certain business arrangements required, in his words, appropriate management of inconvenient variables to protect long-term family interests. I need you to explain exactly what that means, Yerim's recorded voice demanded, her tone carrying genuine confusion rather than complicit awareness. Taemin did not kill Sung-hyun. I know him. Whatever problems we had, whatever distance grew between us during the trial, I never believed he was actually capable of that violence. If you had something to do with what happened to him, I need to know now. Some things are better left unexplained, Han Jae-won's recorded voice replied, carrying the practiced calm of someone accustomed to controlling difficult conversations. What matters is that you now control a company worth $80 million, a company that would have remained divided between two founders indefinitely otherwise. I did what was necessary to secure your future, Yerim. That should be sufficient explanation. You had Sung-hyun killed. Yerim's voice broke, disbelief transforming into horror. And you let Taemin take the blame. He is innocent. I have known that since the trial began, and I said nothing because I was afraid of exactly this conversation, afraid of learning that my own father was capable of this. The recording continued for another 2 minutes, Han Jae-won neither confirming nor denying direct involvement in Sung-hyun's murder, but implying through careful, lawyerly language that professional resources had been employed to ensure certain outcomes, resources he described only as people who specialize in making complicated situations simple. I sat across from Jiwoo, processing the confirmation that Yerim had genuinely not known about the murder scheme before her father's confession, though the recording made clear she had suspected my innocence throughout the trial without taking action to help me, a betrayal of different, but still significant magnitude. This is where the recording becomes complicated, Jiwoo said carefully, watching my expression as she prepared to share the segment's conclusion. After her father's admission, Yerim did not immediately contact police or attempt to expose what she had learned. Instead, listen to what she says next. The recording continued, Yerim's voice now quieter, more calculated than her earlier horrified confrontation. If I expose you now, she said to her father, I lose everything alongside you. The company, my reputation, possibly my own freedom if prosecutors decide I benefited too directly from crimes I only recently discovered. I need time to think about how to handle this correctly, in a way that helps Taemin without destroying everything else in the process. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I processed her words. She was not planning immediate exposure. She was calculating personal risk and benefit, weighing my continued wrongful imprisonment against her own financial and social security. Exactly the kind of self-interested calculation that suggested complicated rather than purely innocent character. She knows the truth, I said slowly. She has known for weeks, possibly longer, and she has done nothing beyond privately confronting her father. Jiwoo nodded grimly. That appears accurate based on this recording, though I would caution against complete judgment without understanding her full internal reasoning. Sometimes people require time to process impossible situations, particularly when immediate action might genuinely destroy their entire life, alongside whatever justice they hope to eventually provide. The visitation request arrived through official channels. Yerim listed as approved visitor under her legal name, scheduled for the following Tuesday afternoon. I spent the intervening days in a state of controlled anticipation, understanding that this meeting would finally allow me to apply my system's growing capabilities directly against the person whose actual knowledge, motivations, and intentions remained the most crucial unknown variable in my entire situation. She arrived looking different than I remembered from our engagement 6 months earlier, thinner, with dark circles beneath her eyes that suggested sleepless nights matching my own recent experience. She sat across from me in the visitation room, hands folded tightly in her lap, unable to meet my eyes directly, for several long seconds. "I know you probably hate me," she began quietly, "for not visiting sooner, for not speaking up during your trial, when I already suspected something was deeply wrong with the evidence against you." I focused on her immediately, holding her gaze the required 3 seconds, while she continued speaking, my system activating to extract whatever truth existed beneath her carefully composed words. Ding! Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. "I need you to tell me everything," I said carefully, watching her reaction, while simultaneously processing what my system had already confirmed about her internal state. "Not what you think I want to hear. The complete truth, regardless of how it makes you look." Yerim took a shaking breath, then began speaking with what appeared to be genuine, unguarded honesty, confirming details that aligned precisely with what my system had detected as her authentic thoughts, rather than calculated performance. "I did not know about Sung-hyun's murder until 3 weeks ago," she said. "I swear to you, Taemin, during your trial I believed, or I convinced myself to believe, that the evidence must be accurate even though something about it felt wrong. I told myself that people sometimes do terrible things under financial pressure, that maybe I simply had not known you as completely as I believed." Her voice cracked slightly, but I never stopped feeling wrong about it. Even after the conviction, even after my father transferred your shares to me, something felt fundamentally broken about the entire situation. Then I overheard him admitting to arranging Sung-hyun's murder, and I realized I had spent months rationalizing away my own instincts because acknowledging the truth would have meant confronting exactly how thoroughly my own father had destroyed an innocent man's life to benefit me financially. "I need to understand something," I said, my voice carrying more control than I actually felt internally. "You have known the complete truth for 3 weeks now. Why have you not gone to authorities? Why have you not tried to visit me sooner, to warn me, to do anything beyond apparently continuing to run the company built from my destruction?" Yerim's composure finally broke completely, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to articulate reasoning that clearly conflicted with her own moral understanding of the situation. "Because I am terrified," she admitted, "not just of losing everything if I expose him, though that fear is real and significant. I am terrified of what he might do to protect himself if I threaten his freedom directly. You do not fully understand what my father is capable of, Taemin. The people he employs, the reach his organization extends beyond simple corporate influence. I have spent 3 weeks trying to find a way to help you that does not result in both of us dying in circumstances that get quietly explained away as unfortunate accidents." She reached into her jacket, withdrawing a small USB drive that she slid across the table with visible reluctance, glancing toward the security camera with the same practiced caution I had observed in Jiwoo's behavior weeks earlier. "This contains financial records I managed to copy from my father's private servers before he could detect my access," she said. bank transfers, communication logs, evidence connecting him directly to at least 5 other cases similar to yours, spanning the past 8 years. I do not know if it provides enough for immediate exoneration, but combined with whatever your attorney has already discovered, it might finally be sufficient to expose the complete scope of what he has built. I stared at the small device, understanding that Yerim's complicated guilt-driven silence had apparently transformed into genuine action, however delayed and however motivated partially by self-preservation, alongside authentic moral crisis. Why now? I asked. What changed in the past 3 weeks that finally pushed you toward actually doing something rather than continuing to rationalize inaction? Yerim looked at me directly for the first time since entering the visitation room, her expression carrying something that looked genuinely like the woman I had once believed I would spend my life alongside. However complicated and imperfect that connection now appeared, given everything that had unfolded. Because I found out he is planning something similar again, she said quietly. A new target. Another business partnership he intends to acquire through the same method that destroyed you. I realized that my silence was not just failing you, it was enabling him to continue destroying other innocent lives indefinitely, as long as I remained too afraid to act. I could not live with that realization any longer, regardless of what personal cost my father's exposure might create for my own future. I sat back, processing the full weight of everything Yerim had just revealed, my system confirming throughout her entire confession that she was speaking authentic truth rather than calculated manipulation, though the moral complexity of her 3 weeks of guilty silence remained genuinely troubling, regardless of her eventual decision to act. We have work to do, I said finally, understanding that whatever complicated feelings I still carried about Yerim's delayed courage would need to wait until after we had successfully exposed her father's conspiracy and secured my release from a life sentence for a murder I had never committed. Because somewhere beyond these prison walls, Han Jae-won was already planning his next victim, and we possessed, for the first time since my arrest, sufficient combined evidence to potentially stop him before that next innocent business founder experienced exactly what had already destroyed 6 years of my carefully built life. I was walking the exercise yard during afternoon recreation when Officer Ryu, the same guard whose phone smuggling operation I had discovered weeks earlier, passed near enough for accidental eye contact. I focused instinctively, the habit now automatic after weeks of constant practice. Ding. Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. I stopped walking, ice spreading through my chest, despite the warm afternoon sun. Isolation wing transfers. I had learned during my weeks inside Cheonan, from careful conversations with other long-term inmates, occasionally served as convenient cover for arranging deaths that could later be explained as unfortunate incidents in facilities with reduced camera coverage and minimal witness presence. I needed to reach Jiwoo immediately, needed to warn her that our investigation had apparently already been discovered, that Han Jae-won's organization was moving to eliminate me before Yerim's evidence could reach appropriate authorities. I requested emergency legal consultation, citing appeal deadline concerns that guards processed without excessive scrutiny, given my status as a model prisoner still building credibility within the facility. Jiwoo arrived within 4 hours, her expression immediately confirming that she carried news as urgent as my own. "Someone accessed my office computer last night," she said without preamble, sliding into the visitation room chair with barely controlled panic, replacing her earlier careful composure. Security footage shows an unauthorized entry at 2 a.m. Someone with proper keycard access, meaning either senior partner Kwon himself or someone he authorized. They copied files from my system, including my complete investigation folder on your case and the other 5 cases I had connected through the pattern. "They know everything," I said, my voice tight with the same fear I could see reflected in her expression. "Which means they know about Yerim's evidence transfer. They know about your gala recording. They know we are close to exposing the complete conspiracy." Jiwoo nodded grimly. "I received a call this morning from an unknown number," she said. A voice I did not recognize. Male, calm in a way that felt more threatening than obvious anger would have been. He said my sister's deportation paperwork had been accelerated, processing complete within 72 hours, unless I immediately ceased what he called unauthorized interference in matters beyond my professional scope. "We have less than 18 hours, I said, calculating the timeline with desperate urgency. "If they move me to isolation tomorrow morning, whatever happens next will likely be irreversible." Jiwoo pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts with shaking hands. I have a colleague at the prosecutor's office, someone I trust completely, who has occasionally helped with legitimate whistleblower cases. If I can get her the evidence tonight, if she can secure some form of protective intervention before your transfer completes, we might have a chance. That plan required trust I was not certain either of us could reasonably extend, given how thoroughly compromised our investigation had already become, but no alternative presented itself within our rapidly shrinking timeline. "Send everything," I said. "The recording, the USB drive contents, everything Yerim provided, and everything you discovered independently. If this fails, if I am eliminated tomorrow morning during transfer, at least the evidence exists with someone positioned to eventually act on it." Jiwoo's eyes filled with tears she fought to control. "This should not be happening," she said. "You are innocent. This entire situation is a catastrophic failure of everything the justice system is supposed to prevent." "I know," I said quietly. "But right now, surviving the next 18 hours matters more than philosophical outrage about systemic failure. I need you to trust that whatever happens tomorrow, I intend to use every capability I possess to survive long enough for this evidence to actually matter." Alone in my cell after Jiwoo's departure, Hoseok already asleep beside me, I focused inward with desperate intensity, testing whether weeks of successful cognitive resonance application had unlocked capabilities beyond simple thought reading. Ding! System analysis. Host has accumulated sufficient experience for early access to Level 3 capability. Suggestion implantation, normally scheduled for unlock at Level 4. Emergency early access, authorized given critical threat assessment to host survival. Warning: suggestion implantation remains untested and potentially unstable. Effects may prove unpredictable, particularly under high-stress application circumstances. Proceed with extreme caution. I did not fully understand what suggestion implantation meant in practical application, but desperate circumstances left little room for cautious theoretical study. I would need to test this capability directly during tomorrow's transfer, when guards arrived to move me toward whatever fate Han Jae-won's organization had arranged within Cheonan's isolation wing. I spent the remaining hours before dawn in restless half-sleep, mind racing through every possible variation of how the following morning might unfold, understanding that my system's capabilities, however remarkable, remained fundamentally untested against the kind of coordinated, professional threat that had apparently already successfully eliminated at least one previous victim without triggering meaningful investigation. 2 guards arrived at my cell precisely at 6 a.m. Standard transfer protocol requiring documentation, I noticed immediately appeared genuinely official, properly processed through legitimate channels, in ways that contradicted Officer Ryu's earlier warning about irregular paperwork. But I recognized neither guard from my 6 weeks inside Cheonan's general population wing, and something about their posture, their controlled efficiency, the way they positioned themselves with tactical awareness that exceeded standard prison guard training, triggered instinctive alarm before I had even processed conscious suspicion. I focused on the nearer guard while they applied transport restraints, forcing the required 3 seconds of eye contact, despite his obvious attempt to avoid direct engagement. Ding! Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. Ice flooded through my entire body as I processed confirmation of exactly the threat I had feared. This was not standard protective custody transfer. This was professional elimination, disguised through legitimate-appearing paperwork and staged to appear as justified response to fabricated escape attempt. I had perhaps 90 seconds, once we reached whatever East Corridor blind spot these operatives intended to exploit, to prevent my own murder using capabilities I had tested only once, under uncontrolled emergency circumstances, with completely unknown reliability or limitation. The guards led me forward through Cheonan's morning corridors, other inmates watching with the careful neutral expressions that survival inside prison culture demanded, none of them aware that they were witnessing what might become the final minutes of my life, unless my desperately acquired system capabilities proved sufficient against professional killers operating with complete institutional cover. We turned into the East Corridor exactly as the guards' thoughts had revealed, fluorescent lighting flickering slightly overhead in a section of the facility that suddenly felt eerily empty compared to the populated corridors we had just traversed. This is where I needed to act, using capabilities I barely understood against threats specifically trained to eliminate exactly the kind of resistance I was about to attempt. I focused everything I possessed, every fragment of desperate determination accumulated across 6 weeks of wrongful imprisonment, toward the nearest guard's mind, attempting for the first time to not simply read his surface thoughts, but to actively implant a suggestion powerful enough to disrupt whatever carefully planned elimination sequence he and his partner had prepared to execute. Ding! Suggestion implantation attempted. Target: transport guard. Designation unknown. Confirmed hostile intent. Implanted directive: sudden overwhelming certainty that supervisor is conducting surprise audit of current transfer, creating immediate compulsion to verify documentation compliance before proceeding further. The guard's expression shifted with sudden, visible confusion, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio despite what should have been clear operational instructions to proceed directly toward the maintenance corridor exit point. "Wait," he said abruptly, his partner turning with obvious surprise at the unexpected interruption to their carefully planned sequence. "I need to verify something with control before we continue. Something feels wrong about this transfer paperwork." His partner's expression flickered between confusion and barely controlled alarm, clearly uncertain whether his colleague's sudden hesitation represented genuine procedural concern or something else entirely, something that made no rational sense given their carefully planned and thoroughly rehearsed elimination sequence. I had created exactly enough disruption, exactly enough unexpected delay for something unprecedented to occur within Cheonan's normally rigid security protocols. A third guard, genuine prison staff responding to a routine corridor patrol schedule that had nothing to do with our transfer, but which now represented my only possible salvation, turned the corner behind us, immediately noting 3 individuals in a corridor section not authorized for general transfer traffic during this specific time window. Identification, the genuine guard demanded immediately, his hand moving toward his own radio with the alert caution of someone recognizing potential security irregularity. The 2 operatives posing as transfer guards exchanged a glance carrying silent, desperate calculation, understanding that their carefully planned elimination sequence had just catastrophically collapsed due to circumstances they could not possibly have anticipated or explained through normal security escalation. I do not know exactly what capability my system had actually provided, whether genuine mental suggestion or simply fortunate psychological pressure, applied at precisely the correct moment to trigger the guard's own suppressed doubts about an assignment that had likely always felt professionally irregular, despite whatever compensation had convinced him to accept it. But whatever the true mechanism, it had worked. The elimination attempt had failed, disrupted by unprecedented, impossible timing that no rational explanation beyond my system's mysterious capabilities could adequately account for. The 2 operatives were detained within minutes, their forged documentation quickly revealed under proper administrative scrutiny, though I understood with grim certainty that whoever had arranged this assassination attempt would simply regroup, adjust strategy, and attempt elimination through whatever alternative method their apparently extensive resources could provide. I had survived this morning, but Han Jae-won's organization now knew with absolute certainty that I possessed some capability, some resource, that had allowed me to disrupt a professionally planned assassination that should have proven impossible to prevent. The conspiracy against me had just escalated from corporate manipulation and fabricated evidence into open, direct attempted murder, confirming beyond any remaining doubt exactly how far Han Jae-won was willing to go to protect his empire, and exactly how much danger everyone connected to exposing that empire, myself, Ji-woo, and even Yerim herself, now genuinely faced. I was still processing the morning's near-death experience, sitting in an administrative holding room while facility staff attempted to untangle the confused documentation surrounding my attempted transfer, when Ji-woo arrived, accompanied by a woman I did not immediately recognize, dressed in the formal attire of prosecutorial authority, rather than standard legal visitation clothing. "This is Deputy Chief Prosecutor Han Soo-jin," Ji-woo said, gesturing toward her companion, with visible relief evident despite the gravity of the situation. "She has reviewed the evidence I sent last night and secured emergency authorization to open formal investigation." I focused immediately on the prosecutor, my system activating from pure instinct despite the desperate exhaustion of surviving an assassination attempt hours earlier. Ding! Cognitive resonance active. Surface thought detected. I stared at Prosecutor Han, processing the surname connection with dawning understanding. "You are related to Han Jae-won," I said carefully, watching her expression for confirmation. Distantly, through marriage, she confirmed without hesitation, apparently recognizing that transparency represented the only viable approach given the sensitivity of prosecuting a family connection. My cousin married into his extended family 15 years ago. I have maintained minimal personal contact, specifically because his business practices always struck me as ethically questionable, though I never possessed concrete evidence until Attorney Park's information arrived last night. The subsequent 3 days passed in a blur of formal interviews, evidence review sessions, and careful legal coordination between Prosecutor Han's office and the evidence Jiwoo and Yerim had independently gathered. What emerged painted a conspiracy far more extensive and sophisticated than even my most paranoid speculation had anticipated. Justice Cho, the judge who had sentenced me to life imprisonment, had received substantial off-book compensation across 7 years, structured through the same Singapore shell corporation network that funded Kwon and Associates' compromised legal representation. Her cryptic sentencing comment about similar recent matters involving corporate restructuring disputes represented, investigators determined, an almost boastful acknowledgement of her role in the pattern, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed her involvement would never face genuine scrutiny. 7 judges across 3 jurisdictions, the investigation eventually revealed, had received similar compensation for handling cases connected to Han Jae-won's corporate acquisition scheme, creating judicial cover that had allowed the conspiracy to operate successfully for nearly a decade before my case's unique circumstances, involving capabilities no rational investigator could have anticipated, finally provided sufficient evidence to expose the complete network. 5 days after my failed assassination attempt, as formal investigation proceedings gained irreversible momentum, Yerim requested emergency visitation, her expression carrying fresh terror that immediately concerned me, given how far we had already progressed toward apparent resolution. "He came to my apartment last night," she said without preamble, sitting across from me with visibly trembling hands. "My father. He knows I provided evidence to the prosecution. He offered me a choice: recant my statements, claim the recording was fabricated through technological manipulation, or he said he could no longer guarantee my safety, given how thoroughly I had betrayed family loyalty." "He threatened you directly," I said, cold fury rising despite my own precarious situation still technically unresolved within the prison system. Yerim nodded, tears streaming down her face. He said it with such calm certainty. Taemin, the same tone he used when discussing Seunghyun's murder during that recorded conversation. I do not think he was bluffing. I think my own father genuinely considered whether eliminating me might prove necessary to protect his empire. The 48 hours following Yerim's terrifying revelation moved with coordinated urgency that finally demonstrated the full weight of legitimate institutional authority, once properly mobilized against corruption that had operated in shadow for nearly a decade. Han Jae-won was arrested at his corporate headquarters during a board meeting, the dramatic circumstances of his detention becoming immediate news coverage that finally exposed publicly what had previously remained hidden beneath careful corporate and judicial manipulation. Justice Cho was suspended pending formal judicial misconduct investigation. Her sentencing decisions across multiple cases, including mine, flagged for comprehensive review. Kwon, the senior partner whose law firm had systematically compromised my defense, and at least 6 other cases, was arrested, attempting to flee the country through Incheon International Airport. His private jet grounded through emergency legal intervention that Prosecutor Han's team secured within hours of discovering his flight plan. I received formal notification of my case's reopening exactly 1 week after surviving the assassination attempt that had nearly ended my life inside Cheonan's East Corridor. My conviction formally vacated, pending complete exoneration proceedings that would require several additional weeks to properly process through appropriate legal channels. I walked through Cheonan's main gate on a grey Tuesday morning, remarkably similar in weather to the day police had first arrested me 4 months earlier, though everything about my circumstances had transformed completely in the intervening months. Jiwoo waited outside, along with Yerim, both women whose complicated but ultimately courageous actions had proven essential to exposing the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my life permanently. As I stepped beyond the facility's outer perimeter, breathing genuinely free air for the first time in 4 months, my system activated with a notification carrying different weight than any previous message. Ding! Cognitive Resonance System. Primary mission complete. Host has successfully survived initial activation period and demonstrated capability sufficient for continued development. Final Disclosure Protocol authorized. This system was not randomly generated in response to your personal trauma, Kang Taemin. You were selected, specifically and deliberately, by an organization operating beyond conventional understanding, monitoring individuals who experience severe injustice combined with genuine moral character sufficient to use extraordinary capability responsibly rather than for personal vengeance alone. I stopped walking, processing implications that suggested my entire ordeal, however genuinely traumatic and dangerous, had somehow been observed, evaluated, and ultimately determined worthy of intervention by forces I had never previously suspected existed. Ding! You are not the first recipient of cognitive resonance capability, nor will you be the last. 17 individuals across recorded history have received similar activation, each selected during moments of extreme injustice, each tasked implicitly with using their capability to expose corruption that conventional systems proved unable to address independently. Your predecessor, the technology founder whose death first alerted you to this conspiracy's pattern, also received partial system activation, though his capabilities remained undeveloped at the time of his elimination, insufficient to prevent his death before achieving meaningful exposure of the conspiracy that killed him. I felt something profound shift in my understanding, transforming my personal ordeal from isolated tragedy into participation in something vastly larger and more significant than I had ever imagined during 4 desperate months of survival and investigation. Ding! Your continued development remains available should circumstances warrant further activation. The organization monitoring your progress has taken note of your successful resolution and believes your particular combination of moral integrity and demonstrated capability under extreme pressure suggests significant potential for addressing injustices beyond your own personal case, should you choose to accept continued responsibility for developing these capabilities toward broader application. I looked at Jiwoo and Yerim waiting for me beyond the facility gates, understanding that whatever choice I eventually made about continuing to develop and apply my extraordinary capabilities, my immediate priority remained rebuilding the life that had been so thoroughly destroyed, reclaiming my company, my reputation, and whatever relationships remained salvageable from the wreckage of Han Jae-won's conspiracy. But the system's final revelation lingered in my awareness as I finally embraced my freedom, understanding that 17 individuals across recorded history had received capabilities similar to mine, that some organization beyond conventional comprehension continued monitoring situations of extreme injustice worldwide, and that my own case, however personally devastating, represented merely the latest chapter in something considerably larger than simple personal vindication. Han Jae-won's trial would begin in 3 months, prosecutors building a case that would likely result in decades of imprisonment for orchestrating a conspiracy that had claimed at least 3 lives and destroyed countless others through fabricated evidence and judicial corruption. Justice Cho and 6 other judicial officials faced their own separate prosecution for accepting corrupt compensation. Kwon and several senior associates at his law firm confronted charges ranging from obstruction of justice to accessory to murder. My own company, restored to my ownership through Yerim's voluntary transfer of shares, she now understood had been acquired through her father's murderous conspiracy, awaited rebuilding, though the process of reconstructing 6 years of destroyed professional relationships and market reputation would require considerable time and effort beyond simple legal exoneration. And somewhere, connected to whatever organization had originally activated my cognitive resonance capabilities, other potential recipients likely existed worldwide, individuals experiencing their own moments of extreme injustice, waiting for circumstances that might eventually determine whether they too would receive extraordinary capability sufficient to expose corruption that conventional systems had proven unable to address independently. I walked toward Jiwoo and Yerim, toward whatever complicated future awaited following 4 months that had transformed me from successful entrepreneur into wrongfully convicted murderer into, finally, exonerated survivor of a conspiracy that extended far beyond anything I could have imagined when police first knocked on my apartment door that grey Tuesday morning. The system remained active in my awareness, patient and watchful, waiting to see what choices I would make now that immediate survival no longer demanded every fragment of my attention and capability. Whatever came next, I understood with growing clarity my ordeal had revealed truths about justice, corruption, and extraordinary capability that would likely shape the remainder of my existence in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. And that is where Kang Taemin's story reaches its resolution, but not its conclusion, because 17 individuals across history have carried cognitive resonance capability, and somewhere in the world right now, another person is experiencing their own moment of impossible injustice, waiting for a system activation that might reveal truths powerful enough to expose corruption no conventional investigation could ever uncover. Han Jae-won's trial looms. Justice Cho's judicial corruption network extends into territories not yet fully investigated, and the mysterious organization monitoring these 17 recipients across recorded history has taken notice of exactly how effectively Taemin used his capabilities under extreme pressure. If you want to see whether Taemin accepts continued responsibility for his extraordinary abilities and discover what other injustices await someone capable of reading the truth behind every lie, subscribe now, because this story of wrongful imprisonment and impossible vindication is only the beginning of something considerably larger.